All right, the last thing I'm going to walk you through this morning is just a little bit on how your bones develop. So we kind of talked about what they look like microscopically, what they look like chemically. So now we're going to get into the physiology part. So bone development is called osteogenesis. We also call it ossification. This one should make sense. Osteo means bone. What does genesis mean? It means the beginning, right? So this is the beginning of bone. It is the process of bone formation. Now, as we go through bone development, we're going to hit it from 3 aspects, developmental aspects. The first is how your bones form to begin with in an embryo. Okay, so Juliana mentioned this. So this is the formation of the skeleton in an embryo. The second sort of developmental aspect that we'll talk about in terms of bone development is postnatal bone growth. Post means after. Natal means birth. So this is literally how your bones grow after you're born. So from infancy up until early adulthood. And then the last sort of way we're going to talk about bone development is a term called bone remodeling. You know, and this is even when you're done growing. I'm 5'6". I've been 5'6" since I was like 13 years old, right? So I've been done growing for a long time. Even though I'm done growing, my bones are still remodeling. They're changing based on the forces and the demands that I place on them. So your bones are constantly changing based on how you use them. Okay? So an example might be someone who decides that they're going to start playing tennis. Right? Maybe their right hand is their serving arm. Okay, so every time they serve and they hit that tennis ball, they're using that right arm. Okay? What's going to happen is over time, as they continue to play tennis, and depending on how much they play, the bones in their right arm are going to remodel based on the demands they're putting on those bones. So a lot of times what we'll see is the bones in the right arm will get thicker, they'll get stronger, they'll get more dense because you need that because you're using it more. So that is bone remodeling. It's your bones sort of changing and changing shape and changing density based on how you're using them. So we're going to start with the very first one, which is just the development of bones in an embryo. So the formation of bones in an embryo starts at around week 8. Oops. I have no idea what happened. There we go. Starts around week 8. Now, just to give you some perspective, I think I've mentioned this before. The day that a woman misses her period, she is considered week 4 in terms of pregnancy. Okay, so the day you miss a period, you don't have it, you are 4 weeks pregnant. So week 8 would just be 4 weeks after that, okay? So around week 8 is when the bones start to form. Now, before the bones form, there is a placeholder, and the placeholder is made of hyaline cartilage. We call it a pre-skeleton, but please know that cartilage is not the skeleton. It's going to get replaced with bone. Okay, but there is like a cartilage placeholder called a pre-skeleton before week 8. So the bones are either going to form in an embryo, they'll form one of 2 ways. One way is through something called intramembranous ossification. Intra means within, membranous means a membrane. So this is, the bones are going to form inside a connective tissue membrane. The other way that bones can form in an embryo is through a process called endochondral ossification. Endo means inside. Chondro is cartilage. And so this is where the bones are basically going to start to form and replace the hyaline cartilage pre-skeleton. They're forming inside that cartilage. The cartilage is breaking down, we're replacing with bone. So let's talk about each of those. I'm going to start with intramembranous ossification. This is bones forming from inside a connective tissue membrane. The only bones in the body that form this way are the skull bones and the clavicles. That's it. So the skull bones and the clavicles, which are also the collarbones, those are forming through an intramembranous ossification. And again, this is where a connective tissue membrane is broken down and we form bone in its place. So I'm going to show you a picture of this process. If you want, I have some words on here, but if you need a more detailed description, it's in your textbook. If you look at this image, you can see in purple in the background, this is a connective tissue membrane, okay, and it is filled with mesenchymal cells. So just to refresh your memory, our connective tissues are connective tissue proper, cartilage, bone, and blood, right? These are all connective tissues. And remember, all of these come from an embryonic tissue called mesenchyme. So in an embryo, if you start with a connective tissue membrane, it has mesenchymal cells in it. Those mesenchymal cells are stem cells, and they can very easily turn into osteoblasts and start forming bone. Okay, so that is what's happening. We have some of those mesenchymal cells become osteoblasts. Remember, B for build. You can see them here in the middle. And we call that little area of osteoblasts an ossification center. So that's going to appear right in the middle of that membrane. And those osteoblasts are going to start making a bony matrix. And you can see they've made that bone. Again, once an osteoblast has secreted matrix all the way around itself, it's now in a lacuna and it becomes an osteocyte. You can still see all these osteoblasts still making that bone, building that bone. Eventually, blood vessels are going to start to invade that area, and you're going to build the bone around those blood vessels, which is going to give us a spongy bone. And then finally, a periosteum will form around the outside. Okay, so now you can see here, this last image, you can see spongy bone in the middle. You can see compact bone on the ends, right? This is indicative of short, flat, and regular bones. And you can see all those osteoblasts on the outside. So this is how intramembranous ossification works, from inside a connective tissue membrane. Endochondral ossification is how all of the other bones in an embryo are going to form. Okay, so they are going to form from inside the cartilage. This is going to also happen around 8 weeks, and it's going to use the hyaline cartilage bones. Now I have bones in parentheses here because hyaline cartilage is not bone, it's still cartilage, but it's going to use those as sort of a model, as a placeholder. Now, in order for bone to take place, we've got to break down the hyaline cartilage and put bone in its place. So here are the steps of endochondral ossification. The perichondrium on the outside is going to be invaded by a ton of blood vessels. That's going to cause all those mesenchymal cells to turn into osteoblasts. We're going to get an ossification center and start making bone inside those placeholders. So you can see in this image, you can see we've got this hyaline cartilage sort of pre-skeleton in blue. You can see that mesenchymal cells become osteoblasts and they form that little ossification center and they start making bone. Okay, blood vessels come in, still making that bone. This is actually what the bone is going to look like at birth. Okay, so you're going to have basically a diaphysis of bone, but notice the epiphyses are mostly still cartilage. At this point, they have what's called a secondary ossification center in them. but there are a lot of cartilage. Remember, cartilage is way more flexible than bone. And you got to squeeze a baby out of a birth canal that is only about this big, right? So having those bones be able to be more flexible so the baby can fit through the birth canal is really important. You don't want the epiphyses to be completely ossified yet. So this is what it's going to look like at birth. And then as that child grows and starts putting weight on the bones and using those bones, you'll see the epiphyses will look a lot more like they do in an adult, okay? They'll fill out with bone.